The woods had always been quiet at night, too quiet, the locals would say, but no one living had ever known why. Only the oldest families whispered the truth, and even they softened the details, as though speaking plainly might summon something listening from the tree line. What none of them realized was that the secret they feared hadn't slept in nearly a century. It had simply waited for the right footsteps to wander close enough. On the night everything began, the air carried a strange metallic chill, the kind that made the lungs sting just a little too long. 3 hikers pushed deeper into the Appalachian backcountry, guided by a map that looked older than the forest itself. They weren't searching for danger, only a place locals called the Hollow, but the Hollow had a way of finding those who didn't belong. It happened just after dusk. The trees thinned, the wind died, and with it came a silence that felt intentional. Ahead of them stood a cabin where no cabin should have been. Weather-beaten. Colorless. Doors swollen shut from decades of storms. It looked as though the forest had tried to swallow it whole and failed. But something else failed too, something human. One of them pressed a hand against the door. It swung open without resistance, exhaling a breath of cold, stale air. Inside, the dust didn't float like normal dust. It clung, almost gripping the beam of their flashlight. And on the far side of the room, nail scratches marred the floorboards as though someone had clawed their way toward the door, or away from something beneath it. The cabin felt wrong immediately, but none of them stepped back. Curiosity has a way of making fools of people, curiosity and the belief that the past stays buried. They found the trunk only minutes later. Iron. Heavy. Chained as though the wood itself was dangerous. And hanging from its lock was a faded tag with 2 words just barely legible. The hikers had set out that morning with a casual confidence, the kind that only comes from ignorance of what lies beyond the well-trodden trails. They laughed and joked as they stepped deeper into the dense Appalachian forest, the canopy above thick enough to swallow sunlight and leave the path in perpetual shadow. The map they carried had been torn and faded, a relic they found in a dusty corner of an old bookstore. It promised hidden hollows, abandoned structures, and a glimpse of the past untouched by time. At first, the forest seemed to comply, offering nothing more than the occasional squirrel darting across roots, the whisper of wind threading through the leaves, and the smell of damp moss clinging to the bark of ancient trees. Hours passed, and the trail became less distinct, almost as if the forest itself were erasing the path behind them, leaving only the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional snapping twig. It was then that one of them noticed it, a sharp contrast to the dark greens and browns that surrounded them. Through the thick tangle of brambles and saplings, a faint outline of a structure emerged, crooked and nearly swallowed by ivy and undergrowth. At first, they assumed it was a shed or perhaps the remains of an old hunting cabin, but the closer they drew, the more unsettling it became. The building was older than anything they had expected to find, its timbers gray and warped, nails rusted into their frames, the roof sagging with the weight of years. Windows were opaque with grime, yet some reflected light in strange, angular patterns that made the interior seem like it held secrets. There was no chimney smoke, no sign of recent life, and yet the air around it felt charged, as though the forest itself had pulled back, allowing this place to exist alone. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances, the kind that acknowledge curiosity mingled with the instinct to flee. But the map had led them here, and each of them carried that stubborn need to see what others could not. They stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft earth littered with leaves and broken twigs, the sound amplified in the stillness. Every step seemed heavier, weighed down by anticipation. The structure, they realized, was not just abandoned, it was carefully concealed, a relic of some meticulous mind intent on leaving the world outside and guarding whatever remained inside. The moment they reached the threshold, the forest fell into silence, and the shadows seemed to lean closer, stretching their fingers across the cracked door in warning, and for the first time, the hikers felt the pulse of history brush against their skin, a sensation that whispered of danger and secrets that had been waiting for decades, hidden deep within the woods. The cabin's interior was a shrine to decay, a place where the passage of time had left its mark in thick layers of dust, cobwebs, and the faint, sour scent of rot. The hikers' flashlights trembled across warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper, revealing the skeleton of a home long abandoned. Every step echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls as though the space itself were hollow, hiding whispers from the past. In the far corner, Partially obscured by a toppled chair and a collapsed table, they noticed a heavy, iron-bound trunk, its surface pitted with rust and mottled with streaks of age. Chains wrapped around it like vines, thick and stubborn, locking the weathered wood in place, and a lock with an intricate, almost ceremonial design held the two halves together. The hikers instinctively circled it, sensing its unnatural presence, as though it had been waiting for someone curious enough to find it. One of them knelt, brushing away decades of dust to reveal a tag swinging loosely from the lock. The paper was brittle, yellowed, and barely legible, its ink faded to a grey haze, yet the letters seemed deliberate and unnervingly urgent, warning anyone who dared approach to leave it alone. The trunk emanated a coldness that the warm, summer air of the forest could not explain. When they finally forced themselves to inspect the seams, the metal creaked under the strain of movement, protesting with groans that echoed like distant cries. They could feel something pressing against the edges from inside, as if whatever lay within were alive or restless, straining against the confinement imposed decades before. Despite the warnings, their curiosity was overpowering, gnawing at the edges of reason. One of them, shaking, traced the chain with a fingertip and imagined the stories it might conceal, objects of immense value, relics of forgotten rituals, or perhaps, horrors that should never see the light of day. The cabin seemed to lean in closer, shadows pooling and stretching unnaturally toward the group, their eyes reflecting the dim flashlight beams in ways that made the corners of the room appear alive. The very air seemed to thrum with anticipation, thick with the secrets of a man who had once called this place home, a man whose thoughts and obsessions had been imprinted in every timber and floorboard. They could not shake the feeling that the trunk was a threshold, a barrier between the known world and something much darker, something carefully hidden and deliberately preserved. The chains, rusted and sturdy, seemed less like protection and more like a warning, a guardian of unspeakable knowledge, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to lift the lid and see what had been left behind. Each of them stared, hesitant, frozen between fear and desire, knowing that whatever they would discover inside the trunk could not be unseen, and yet every instinct pulled them closer, compelling them to confront the secret that had been buried and locked away, hidden in the shadows of a cabin long swallowed by the forest. Beneath the oppressive weight of dust and decay, the hikers finally managed to lift the trunk's lid, its hinges groaning like something waking from a long sleep. Inside lay a collection of objects that seemed ordinary at first, yet carried a disquieting aura, as if each piece had absorbed the essence of the man who once possessed them. There were faded photographs, yellowed with age, depicting stern faces that stared with intensity beyond their years, eyes that seemed to follow every movement within the cabin. The center of the trunk held a bundle of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and brittle, the spines creased from decades of careful use. One journal, larger than the others and marked with the name Elias Mercer scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand, drew immediate attention. The pages inside were filled with meticulous handwriting, lines looping and jagged, sometimes interrupted by smudges and stains that suggested tears, sweat, or worse. Flipping through them, the hikers discovered the thoughts of a man who had lived entirely apart from the world, a recluse obsessed with ideas that teetered on the edge of madness. He wrote not only of daily routines and survival but of a compulsion that had consumed him, a mission to protect, or perhaps destroy, something intrinsic to his own bloodline. There were diagrams, crude sketches of chemical apparatuses, notes on poisons, and accounts of people who had entered and left his life in ways the outside world would never understand. The journal carried the weight of confession, the kind that drags guilt across generations, spilling the truth in a way that demanded acknowledgement. Each entry deepened the sense of unease, revealing a man obsessed with control, purity, and the meticulous shaping of fate according to his own moral compass. As they turned the pages, the hikers noticed names of family members, dates of birth, and intimate details that blurred the line between diary and evidence. A creeping horror grew in the air around them, thickening the dust and making the shadows seem heavier. The more they read, the clearer it became that Elias Mercer had not been an ordinary recluse. He had been a man who believed he could bend life itself to his will, to dictate who survived, who faltered, and who should vanish entirely. The cabin seemed to respond to their discovery, the floorboards groaning beneath the weight of unseen memories, the walls pressing in with the resonance of decades of secrecy. Each page they uncovered felt like a step closer to something that had been waiting silently, deliberately, for a new set of eyes to awaken it. With every sentence, the journal revealed the darkness at the heart of the Mercer name, a darkness that had lain hidden in these woods, sealed in iron and leather, and preserved by isolation, until the right people arrived to read it, to understand it, and perhaps, to carry the story forward in ways that would alter their perception of reality and the quiet, foreboding forest that had kept the secret for so long. As the hikers continued to leaf through the fragile pages of Elias Mercer's journal, the nature of his obsessions became horrifyingly clear. The entries shifted from mundane notes on weather and supplies to confessions that seemed almost ritualistic, the kind of thoughts a man might whisper only to himself, fearing the judgment of the living. Elias wrote of his family not as relations bound by love, but as experiments, subjects in a grand design only he could comprehend. He believed the bloodline carried an inherent flaw, a hereditary corruption that would manifest in weakness, deformity, or moral decay, and he had taken it upon himself to intervene. The language he used was clinical yet infused with reverence, describing the preparation of tinctures, the administration of small doses meant to test tolerance, the slow observation of reactions over days, weeks, sometimes months. Every relative became a variable in an experiment designed to cleanse the family, an effort he justified as protection, though the lines between preservation and destruction blurred in the careful curves of his script. The journal chronicled not only the methods but the reasoning, revealing a mind convinced that the world itself would thank him for his interventions, that the consequences of inaction were far worse than the acts he committed. He described watching siblings, cousins, even children, noting subtle changes in demeanor, growth, and vitality, tallying his own failures and successes in painstaking detail. The more they read, the more the hikers realized that these were not the writings of a disturbed recluse simply seeking control over his environment. These were the confessions of a man who had deliberately poisoned his own kin, convinced that he was shaping a destiny that transcended moral law. The words were often accompanied by meticulous diagrams, vials, and crude measurements, as if he were cataloguing a body of work that was equal parts science and obsession. There were passages where the tone shifted entirely, as though he were speaking to some unseen presence, pleading for guidance or forgiveness, yet never admitting doubt about his purpose. The journal painted a picture of a household governed by fear and obedience, a lineage systematically experimented upon, monitored, and catalogued by a single, tyrannical mind. Every detail felt invasive, as if the journal itself were a living extension of Elias's control, leaving the hikers unsettled, each page turning like a pulse in the still cabin. They began to understand that the man who had inhabited this space had been methodical, cunning, and terrifyingly devoted to a personal ideology that saw family not as refuge, but as the canvas for his dark ambition, a truth buried deep in the woods that could never be ignored once discovered. The realization settled on them slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. They were reading the direct confessions of a man who had poisoned his own bloodline, a secret so grim that the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the consequences to awaken. Among the scattered papers in the trunk, the hikers discovered a second, smaller notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling yet surprisingly intact. Unlike the personal confessions of the larger journal, this one was precise, almost clinical, cataloguing substances, measurements, and observations with a meticulous hand that left no room for error. It was an apothecary ledger, a record of chemicals and tinctures that ranged from the mundane to the grotesquely lethal. Each entry was dated, often accompanied by a shorthand notation of its effects on an individual, and sometimes a sketch of the apparatus used for preparation. The ledger revealed a methodical mind obsessed not only with the theory of bloodline purification but with its practical application. Names were listed alongside dosages, reactions, and warnings, a testament to the systematic cruelty with which Elias Mercer had approached his family. The hikers read of powders ground from roots and herbs, distillations of metals and acids, and liquids that promised subtle effects at first, escalating into irreversible outcomes over time. The notes described precise timing, how meals were to be laced, how potions were to be administered when the targets were unsuspecting or at their weakest. Some entries were chillingly brief, noting only a name, a substance, and the phrase effect achieved, as though acknowledging the death or illness of a relative with bureaucratic detachment. Others contained more elaborate instructions, warnings to avoid certain mixtures, or observations on how the human body reacted to repeated doses. The ledger painted a clear portrait of a man who had treated his own family as subjects in a long-term experiment, blending knowledge of chemistry with an obsession for control. What unsettled the hikers most was the sheer scale of it. The pages stretched over years, each one carefully maintained, each result meticulously recorded. The apothecary ledger didn't just detail the poisons themselves, it chronicled a system, a methodology that turned domestic life into a laboratory. The forest outside the cabin seemed to grow darker as they turned the pages, the silence amplifying the implications of what they were reading. It was impossible to ignore that every entry represented a real human consequence, someone who had suffered or died at the hands of a man convinced he was enacting a higher moral or spiritual justice. The hikers felt an oppressive weight, the air thick with the legacy of deliberate, calculated cruelty. Each formula, each annotation, was more than just words, it was a confession, a blueprint for the destruction of his own lineage. As the shadows of the cabin deepened, the realization settled like frost in their bones. Elias Mercer had not merely theorized about purifying his bloodline, he had carried it out with unwavering precision, using knowledge, cunning, and a chilling disregard for the lives of those he should have loved. The ledger was the proof, the unmistakable evidence that the horrors documented in the larger journal were not hypothetical musings but lived reality, a sequence of calculated acts that poisoned generations long before the hikers had even arrived in the woods. The forest behind the cabin was thick with undergrowth, a tangled expanse of roots, brambles, and moss-covered stones, and yet, guided by a combination of instinct and unease, the hikers felt compelled to explore it. Something about the cabin, the iron-bound trunk, the journals, and the apothecary ledger seemed to draw them beyond the threshold, as though the answers they sought were not confined to its walls. Their footsteps pressed softly into the damp earth, leaves crunching lightly underfoot, but there was a weight in the air that made the hair on the backs of their necks rise. As they pushed through a particularly dense thicket, one of them stumbled across a small depression in the ground, almost invisible beneath the layer of fallen leaves. The earth had been disturbed recently, or perhaps long ago, though the soil had settled enough to appear undisturbed to the casual eye. Curiosity overpowered caution, and they began to dig, their hands scraping against roots and soil, revealing the edges of crude wooden markers beneath. One after another, small graves appeared, shallow and uneven, their markers simple and unadorned, some marked with initials, others with barely recognizable names, and all suggesting lives ended far too soon. A cold realization settled over the group. These were not mere garden plots or forgotten tools, these were burial sites, hastily prepared and carefully concealed, each one telling a story of someone taken before their time. The hikers examined the soil, noting its age and consistency, and the closer they looked, the more chilling details emerged. Small fragments of bone, discolored by decades beneath the earth, peeked from the edges of the graves, and it became painfully clear that the apothecary ledger and journals they had found were not theoretical, they were documentation of real human suffering. The methodical precision that had so unnerved them indoors translated seamlessly to the arrangements outside, suggesting that Elias Mercer had overseen not only the preparation of toxins but also the final resting places of his victims. There was no ceremonial flourish, no attempt to memorialize or mourn. The graves were practical, cold, and functional, part of a larger system designed to maintain secrecy while executing a personal vision. As they unearthed more, the weight of the realization pressed upon them, the forest growing darker, the shadows lengthening with the fading light of day. Each grave deepened the sense of horror, confirming the scope of the man's obsession and cruelty. The woods themselves seemed complicit, the canopy above pressing down like a shroud, carrying the whispers of long-forgotten screams. With every handful of soil removed, the hikers understood that they had stumbled upon the physical remnants of decades of deliberate, systematic poisoning, a chilling testament to the lengths one man had gone to control and destroy his own bloodline, leaving the evidence hidden in the heart of the forest. The final entries in Elias Mercer's journal were unlike the meticulous, clinical records that preceded them. They carried a frenzied intensity, a desperation that pulsed through every word. The earlier passages had documented small-scale experiments, controlled doses, and careful observations, but now the focus had narrowed to a single individual, a child described with an almost unnatural specificity, as if this one life carried the culmination of his life's work. Elias referred to this child repeatedly, noting unusual physical traits, rapid cognitive development, and, in his own words, an instability that both fascinated and terrified him. He wrote of an obsession with ensuring the child's survival, yet simultaneously with controlling every aspect of growth, monitoring diet, sleep, exposure to light, and emotional stimuli, all meticulously recorded in long tables and graphs. There were sketches of the child's features, exaggerated and almost grotesque, highlighting eyes, hands, and posture that seemed to signify both brilliance and aberration. As the hikers read, a creeping unease settled over them. The entries described the lengths Elias had gone to isolate this final generation, the extreme measures taken to prevent outside influence, and the psychological manipulation employed to shape behavior. His notes indicated sleepless nights spent observing reactions to subtle poisons, medicinal tonics, and environmental changes, all designed to cultivate the traits he valued while eradicating what he considered weaknesses. There was a sense of obsession bordering on mania, as though the very essence of the child's being had become a canvas for a centuries-old ideology of purity and perfection. The hikers could almost hear the scratch of the pen across paper, feel the tension in the cabin as each day's experiments were carried out in silence and secrecy. And yet, there was a deeper horror woven through the journal, a recognition on Elias's part that the child's condition was not entirely predictable, that the bloodline he had sought to control still held an element of defiance, of randomness, that no amount of intervention could fully suppress. He described moments of elation when the child appeared to respond as intended, and moments of panic when subtle deviations occurred, illustrating the thin line between control and catastrophe. Every page carried a chilling sense that the child was both his creation and his punishment, a living embodiment of decades of manipulation, obsession, and cruelty. The hikers felt a mounting dread, understanding that the final generation was the apex of a systematic, calculated campaign of domination over life itself, and that this child, born into a legacy of deliberate suffering and meticulous control, may have carried within them a power, knowledge, or secret that transcended the intentions of the man who had sought to shape it. The journal suggested that the outcomes of Elias's obsession were far from concluded, that the child's presence in the woods may have left a trace, an echo of manipulation and unnatural design that could still linger, waiting to confront anyone who dared uncover the truth of what had been done. The cabin had already begun to feel suffocating as the hikers lingered over the journals and ledgers, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening unnaturally with every passing minute. A chill had settled in, despite the warm afternoon outside, and the air seemed heavier, as if it carried a weight from decades past. One of the hikers, drawn inexplicably toward a loose floorboard near the back wall, knelt to examine it, brushing aside dust and debris to reveal a faint outline of a hidden cavity beneath. As fingers traced the edges, a sudden rustle from the surrounding forest pulled the group's attention outward, and a sense of being watched crept over them. The forest, which had seemed merely silent, now felt alive, holding its breath in expectation. Unease prickled along their spines, yet curiosity propelled them forward, deeper into the cabin's secrets. The missing hiker, who had been closest to the journals, wandered toward the rear door, saying something inaudible, as if responding to a whisper only they could hear. A moment later, the others realized the person was gone, leaving behind only a trail of footprints in the thin layer of dust that coated the floor. They called out, their voices echoing unnaturally in the small space, but the sound seemed to be swallowed before it could reach the trees outside. Panic began to settle in, a cold, creeping fear that gnawed at their instincts and made their hearts pound with unnatural intensity. Searching the cabin, they found no trace, no indication that their companion had left willingly. The air around the trunk and journals felt charged, as if the words on the pages had come alive, responding to the intrusion with a subtle but insistent force. Outside, the forest had changed too, shadows stretched longer, and the wind, which had been a gentle whisper, now carried an almost imperceptible hiss, like the echo of something moving just beyond sight. The hikers began to notice ash-gray impressions on the ground, footprints that appeared in no logical pattern, sometimes leading toward the forest, sometimes circling back toward the cabin. The trail was impossible to follow, shifting as if the earth itself were rearranging to obscure its path. The sense of urgency grew, the oppressive silence pressing on their ears, hearts, and minds. It was clear something had awakened, something tied to the child Elias Mercer had obsessed over, something that had been waiting for intruders to stumble upon its domain. The realization that one of their own had vanished without explanation left the group in stunned terror, understanding that the horrors chronicled in the journals were not merely history, but an active presence, a living shadow still patrolling the woods, asserting its will over anyone foolish enough to trespass. Their fear was tangible, almost suffocating, as they sensed that the Mercer legacy had not ended with the last entry in the journals, and that something human, unnatural, or somewhere in between was still very much awake and aware of them, watching from the darkness beyond the cabin walls. After the unsettling disappearance of one of their group, the remaining hikers felt a palpable tension pressing in from every direction. The forest that had once seemed merely quiet now pulsed with a presence they could not name, a subtle awareness that followed their every movement. As night descended, shadows thickened between the trees, twisting into shapes that suggested motion where there should be none. The hikers strained their eyes, expecting the rustle of a deer or the flight of a nocturnal bird, yet the forest seemed unnervingly still, as though it were holding its breath. Then, from deep among the trunks, they caught glimpses, fleeting, almost imperceptible, of something moving with human-like grace, yet with an unnatural gait, appearing and vanishing among the trees in a way that defied logic. The journals had hinted at a child, the culmination of Elias Mercer's obsession, described with traits that were uncanny, almost otherworldly. Now, decades later, it seemed that the stories were not entirely confined to the past. The glimpses became more frequent, always at the edge of vision, accompanied by the occasional reflection of light from pale eyes, wide and unblinking, staring from the shadows. A chill ran through the hikers as the realization sank in. The child, or whatever had become of that final generation, might still be alive, wandering these woods long after the man who had created it had perished. Whispers of movement, faint footsteps, and sudden rustling of branches surrounded them, heightening the sense of being watched and followed. The journal had described not only physical experiments but behavioral manipulation, isolation, and psychological conditioning, suggesting that the child's abilities, intellect, or perhaps even instincts had been honed to a degree that transcended ordinary human understanding. The hikers began to notice small, inexplicable signs, depressions in the undergrowth, half-formed trails that ended abruptly, and glimpses of tiny objects carefully arranged, almost ritualistically, suggesting intelligence and awareness. Each sign carried the unmistakable implication that this presence knew the forest intimately, and more disturbingly, knew them. Fear gnawed at their resolve as they pieced together the horrifying truth. Elias Mercer had not merely poisoned his family to satisfy some twisted moral ideal, he had created a living legacy, one that endured far beyond the limitations of mortality, a final generation whose life had been carefully molded to outlast its creator. As the hikers moved cautiously through the underbrush, every shadow seemed to follow, every sound amplified into warning. The forest was no longer simply a backdrop. It had become a theater in which the consequences of human obsession were still performing, a reminder that some legacies are too dark to die, and some secrets, once unearthed, continue to haunt those who uncover them. In that moment, the hikers understood with a creeping horror that the child, now grown or changed into something beyond comprehension, was not merely a story, but a presence, alive and aware, marking its territory in the woods where no one should tread. The hikers' apprehension grew with every step deeper into the shadowed heart of the cabin's surrounding woods. The journals and apothecary ledgers had already painted a grim picture of Elias Mercer's life and obsessions, but the final truth, the culmination of his actions, remained hidden, and it called to them with a quiet insistence. Following the uneven trail behind the cabin, they came across a section of earth that seemed unnaturally level, as though the soil had been meticulously manipulated over years. A faint outline suggested the presence of a concealed structure, partially buried and swallowed by roots and undergrowth. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but the hiker's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary storage pit or cellar. As they cleared away the moss and tangled vines, a hidden hatch emerged, its edges worn smooth from decades of careful concealment. The moment they lifted it, a stale, metallic odor rose from below, carrying the weight of history, secrecy, and something far darker. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the walls lined with timbers etched with scratches, symbols, and crude notations that hinted at the obsessive care of someone obsessed with concealment. The hikers exchanged hesitant glances, but the pull of revelation outweighed fear. Every step down the stairs seemed to press them further into the past, the air growing colder and heavier, saturated with the unmistakable residue of human design, of experiments carried out in secret, and of the calculated cruelty that had defined Elias Mercer's life. At the bottom, the chamber stretched farther than expected, its dimensions carefully constructed to house both work and concealment. Shelves lined with vials, jars, and tools of meticulous experimentation suggested that this was the epicenter of his life's work. Small, crude restraints and observation tools hinted at subjects who had once occupied this space, their presence lingering in the air like a faint, inescapable echo. But it was the center of the room that sent the most chilling message, a raised platform, encircled with markings, dark stains, and remnants of substances that had been used to manipulate life itself. The chamber was a shrine to obsession, control, and the deliberate destruction and remaking of a bloodline, preserved and protected from the outside world with painstaking care. The journals had hinted at it, the ledgers had confirmed it, and now the hikers stood in its midst, a hidden domain where generations had been poisoned, altered, and observed, and where Elias Mercer had enacted the final, decisive interventions that shaped the fate of his own family. The air seemed to hum with the memory of those acts, and every shadow in the chamber whispered of the consequences that had followed, consequences that may not have ended, as the presence of the final generation, the child or entity he had obsessed over, could still linger, unseen, waiting, and watching, tethered forever to the darkness buried beneath the cabin.